The city never slept, but it did bleed. Soren Vask had been watching it bleed for 11 months. He stood in the shadow gap between two shipping containers on Dock 7 of the Varath station's lower ring, his collar turned up against the recycled air that always smelled faintly of engine coolant and alien sweat. The docks ran 3 shifts. Nobody asked who you were on the docks, which was exactly why the Keth Syndicate used them, and exactly why station intelligence had sent Soren to disappear inside them. 11 months, long enough to forget which parts of himself were still his. He pressed 2 fingers to the compies behind his ear. 1 pulse, nothing back. That was normal. Contact came on their schedule, not his. Inspector Dorev ran things her way, and her way meant Soren sat in the dark until she decided he'd learned something worth hearing. He'd learned plenty. The question was whether he'd survive long enough to report it. The Keth Syndicate occupied that 3rd category of criminal organization, the kind that doesn't exist, officially, in the sense that no compact filing would name it, no street directory would list it, no law enforcement report would describe it by its own name rather than by the names of its component transactions. It was visible only in the pattern of things, shipments that arrived with no logged departure point, accounts that balanced in ways that required believing in coincidences too numerous to be coincidental, meetings that took place in the maintenance sublevels between people who had no official reason to meet. Soren had been taught to read those patterns in the same way a navigator is taught to read current and weather, not as individual data points, but as a shape, a coherence, the pressure that a large thing exerts on the smaller things around it. He'd been reading the Syndicate's shape for 11 months. He knew its rhythms now the way you know a place you've lived in long enough to stop seeing. The shift change on Dock 7 that always ran 20 minutes late because the Keth operations supervisor and the Orc cargo chief had a standing argument about manifest verification protocols that neither of them intended to resolve. The particular hour, 3 shifts into the cycle, when the ventilation system on sublevel 2 dropped pressure slightly, and every experienced resident of the sublevels reached for a jacket without consciously registering why. The weekly communication window that Nam used to receive reports from the Syndicate's outer cells, which ran exactly 40 minutes, and ended with Nam standing alone at the operations room window for another 10 minutes. Looking at something Soren had never been able to determine. 11 months was long enough to become part of a rhythm. It was also long enough to understand exactly how dangerous that was. The Varath station was a joint species trading post orbiting a gas giant that nobody had bothered to name properly in any of the 43 registered languages on file. Humans called it Old Yellow. The Keth called it something that translated roughly as the eye that doesn't blink. The Orc clans who worked the lower docks had 17 different names for it, most of them involving concepts of patience and inevitability that human linguists were still arguing about. The station's official population was 90,000. The real number was closer to 150. The difference lived in the maintenance tunnels and service corridors, and the 3 sublevels that didn't appear on any charter. The Keth Syndicate operated out of those sublevels. They moved refined isotopes, the kind that could run a colony ship's reactor for a decade, or reshape a continent's geology inside a week, depending on who bought them and what they paid extra for. The Syndicate wasn't picky about buyers. That was the problem. The other problem was that Soren had started to care about some of the people he was supposed to be using. He'd tried in the early months to maintain the clean operational distance that the briefings described. He told himself that caring was a technique, a tool, like any other, deployed in service of the mission. You calibrated the caring carefully, kept it functional, never let it go deep enough to compromise the outcome. He'd believed this. He'd been good at it in previous assignments that hadn't lasted 11 months. 11 months was a different problem. 11 months was long enough for the technique to become something else. Long enough for the patterns of a place to become familiar not as data, but as home. The particular sounds of the station at 300, the way the cargo teams called to each other across the bays in the abbreviated language of people who did physical work in coordinated groups, the reliability of the ventilation pressure drop, and its unspoken signal to reach for a jacket. Long enough to stop calculating the carrying and just feel it, which was, he suspected, exactly what Dorev had known would happen and had calculated for, and which was also the thing she couldn't tell him at the briefing, because if he'd known it was coming, he wouldn't have let it. That was always the problem. He'd been told it would be, at the beginning, when Dorev had sat across from him in the gray briefing room on Way Station 9, and laid it out in that flat voice she used. When she was telling you something, she'd already decided she was going to tell you. Undercover work wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about being so completely yourself that nobody thought to look for the thing you were hiding underneath. You didn't pretend to like the people. You just let yourself actually like them, just enough, and then you made sure you could still pull the trigger when the time came. She had looked at him for a long moment after saying that. "Can you do that?" she'd asked. He'd thought about the briefings, the protocols, the careful vocabulary of operational distance. He'd thought about every previous assignment he'd run, each one cleanly closed, cleanly filed, himself walking out the other side intact and contained. He'd thought about the kind of person who could do that indefinitely, who could let themselves care, just enough, and then pull back on command, and walk away clean every time. He'd thought, "I don't know. I'll let you know," he'd said. That had been before he met Varha. She was the weapons coordinator for the Keth Inner Circle, technically a freelancer, practically indispensable. Orc clan, Gorv except, which meant she was tall enough that the standard height corridors forced her to angle her horns and duck her head through every doorway, and broad enough across the shoulders that she walked with that particular sideways pivot that large-frame people develop after years of navigating spaces built for smaller bodies. Her skin was the deep blue-gray of a storm front. Her tusks were worn low, filed to blunt points in the style of Gorvek warriors who had survived long enough to stop needing to frighten people. The other syndicate members, Keth mostly, with their four-limbed precision and their chitinous faces that never quite resolved into expressions Soren could read, treated her with the kind of professional respect that has a sharp edge to it. They needed her. They did not particularly like needing her. She coordinated weapons the way a human accountant coordinates finances, methodically, with a terrifying memory for detail and an absolute lack of sentiment about the numbers. She knew the provenance of every piece in the syndicate's inventory. She knew the maintenance cycles, the failure rates, the legal thresholds, the gray market routes that kept the hardware moving without triggering compact inspection protocols. She had opinions about calibration standards that she would share if you made the mistake of asking, and some of them were fascinating, and all of them were delivered in a voice that the Keth hierarchy found grating. Her voice was the problem, for the Keth at least. Orc clan vocal anatomy produced sounds in registers that overlapped badly with the Keth's primary sensory reception. Something about the resonant frequencies hitting their chemoreceptors in an irritating, rather than communicative way. Nobody had ever bothered to solve this problem with better translation tech, because nobody with budget authority had cared enough to try. The practical result was that every time Varha spoke in a standard meeting, the Keth Syndicate's senior people visibly flinched, and several of them had taken to communicating with her exclusively through text relays, which she found insulting and they found necessary. Soren had watched this dynamic for 8 months before he understood what it was costing her. He'd assumed it was pragmatism on her part. She adapted, she used the text relays, she got the work done. Then he'd been present in a meeting where Nam had given instructions to the assembled team through the standard vocal channel, and every other person in the room had received those instructions directly, and Varha had received a text relay summary 6 minutes later, and he'd watched her read it with an expression so carefully controlled that it gave away exactly how much control it was taking. There was a specific quality to being systematically excluded from the room you were standing in. He'd seen it before. He recognized it. That night he'd looked up Gorvak vocal anatomy in the station's xenobiology archive, and then the auditory processing range of Keth sensory biology, and then the comparative notes on how humans slotted into that spectrum. He'd sat with the information for a while. Then he'd gone to find her. She'd been in the side room, at the work table, running inventory numbers in the particular focused quiet she brought to everything. He'd sat down across from her without invitation, not unusual. They'd been working in the same spaces for months, and he'd said, without preamble, because he'd found that she responded better to directness than to approach, "I was reading about Gorvak vocal biology." She'd looked up. The amber eyes were careful, unreadable. "Why?" "Curiosity, and because I realized I'd been in 12 meetings with you and I never thought about what it sounded like from your end." He paused. "Your voice, the way it registers for humans, it's not like the Keth experience it. There are undertones, harmonic structures. I've been listening to you talk for months without thinking about what I was actually hearing." A very long pause. "What do you hear?" He considered this honestly. He was not a musical person. He did not have the vocabulary. He used the one that was closest to accurate depth, like something played in a large space, the kind of sound that tells you there's more room than you thought. She had gone very still, the kind of stillness that is its own form of response. "I haven't," she said slowly, "heard myself described that way." He waited. "The Gorvak have a tradition," she said after a moment. "Voice song. Before a significant action, one of the sept sings the lineage of the ones who went before. It was considered important. It is a way of saying, all of those people were here and here is what they passed forward and here is who is carrying it now." She paused. "I haven't sung for 7 years, not since I left my sept, because there was no one who could hear it correctly." He sat with that for a moment, the weight of it. 7 years. Why did you leave? A slight shift in her posture. Not avoidance. He'd learned to read the difference, processing, ordering. "My father was a fool who walked into a sealed situation because the person who sent him in never told him what they'd actually planned. The sept leader had decided his death was an acceptable cost. The other sept members had decided the leader's decision was acceptable. I disagreed with everyone involved and said so, loudly, in the full harmonic register." She paused. "The leader did not enjoy this. I left before the disagreement could be resolved in a more permanent way." "Your father sang," Soren said. She looked at him. "How did you know that?" "The tradition. You said one of the sept sings the lineage, and you're carrying it even though you left. You didn't say it was lost. You said there was no one who could hear it correctly." Another long pause. Something in her expression shifted very slightly, the way deep water shifts when something moves through it far below the surface. "He sang, since I was old enough to remember. Going back 15 generations," he said. "All of them fools who got killed by the system eventually. But they kept singing anyway." A pause. He thought that was important, continuing the thing regardless. Soren thought about a woman humming in a kitchen, not songs he recognized, just patterns. Fragments of something old and human, carried forward without ceremony, passed into him without his knowing he'd received it. He'd only remembered it in pieces, the way you remember old music. Suddenly, incompletely, with more feeling than information. "My mother hummed," he said. "Not songs anyone would recognize, just patterns, while she was working. I don't know where she got them. I only remember them in pieces now." Varha considered this for a long moment. "That is a kind of singing," she said finally. They went back to work. But something had changed, imperceptibly, the way atmospheric pressure changes before a storm. He started noticing the way she held herself differently when the Keth senior members addressed her through their text relays. The slight tightening across her jaw, the controlled deliberateness with which she composed her replies. He started noticing when she ate, which was rarely and quickly, always at the work table, always with one eye on the door. He started noticing that she trusted nobody in the syndicate entirely, including himself, and that she trusted him more than she trusted the rest of them, and that this was both a tactical asset and something that sat in his chest like a stone he'd swallowed by mistake. He told Dorev none of this. He reported the useful things: shipment schedules, buyer coordinates, the name of the syndicate's contact inside the compact's customs authority. He didn't tell her about the voice, or the father, or the 15 generations of Gorvak fools killed by whatever system happened to be grinding them at the time. He told himself it was operational discretion. He told himself it didn't affect his judgment. The lie was a comfortable one. He'd been living in it for 3 months. Then the syndicate announced the Meridian job, and the lie got a lot harder to maintain. The Meridian Compact Depository was the station's primary isotope storage facility, the legitimate one, the one with the compact seal and the inspection records and the rotating security roster. It held reserves for 37 colony systems. If someone pulled a significant percentage of those reserves at once, those systems would have to go to emergency power protocols within 6 weeks, and some of them would start losing life support within 9. Not abstract numbers, colonies, real populations, many of them second or third generation residents who had never known any home but the one they'd built in a place that needed those reserves to keep them alive. Nam, the syndicate's director of operations, had a buyer who wanted a significant percentage. The buyer had agreed to a price that was, by any reasonable measure, obscene. The job was scheduled for the compact's annual maintenance window, a 48-hour period when the depository reduced its security rotation to allow for systems updates. Somebody in the compact's maintenance scheduling office had made sure that window was 3 days earlier than it appeared on any official record. The same somebody had made sure the syndicate's 3 competing operations teams knew about each other's plans, and had begun to suspect each other of being the source of the compact intelligence leak that Soren had actually been feeding Dorev for 11 months. The paranoia was organic now, running through the syndicate like a slow infection. Nam had done nothing to discourage it, which Soren had filed away as a data point without yet knowing what it pointed toward. He'd found out the night before Varha came to him. He'd been alone in the operations room, late, running the approach vectors for the 3rd time. Nam had gone. Fu had gone. The Keth logistics staff had rotated out, and in that quiet, the particular late station quiet where the ventilation systems became audible and the cargo lifts moved at half speed and the whole enormous structure seemed to exhale, he'd noticed something in the exit route documentation that didn't resolve correctly. The routes had been redrawn, not substantially, not in any way that would have registered to someone doing a standard review. But when he mapped them against the original architectural survey of the depository's surrounding structure, 3 of the 4 external exits from the central processing hub terminated in a sealed service corridor that had been decommissioned 6 years ago. Nobody had updated the survey data. Whoever had drawn the new routes either hadn't checked against the survey or had checked against it deliberately. He'd sat with that for a long time. Then he'd put everything back exactly as he'd found it and gone to his bunk and lain in the dark looking at the ceiling of his quarters and thought about what it meant to be the one being used. Varha found him the next morning. She'd come into the side room on the pretext of a redundancy check, closed the door with the casualness of someone doing it for noise rather than secrecy, handed him a data tablet, and waited for him to look up from it before she spoke. Nam has changed the exit routes, she said very quietly. He kept his eyes on the tablet. What do you mean? The new exit routes from Meridian eliminate the maintenance corridor options. Every exit goes through the central processing hub. A pause. The central processing hub has 2 entry points. If someone wanted to seal all 3 operational teams inside at once, that's how they would do it. He made himself not react. He finished the line he was cross-referencing and moved to the next one. Nam designed the exit routes. I know. I also know that Nam received a communication from an external contact 3 days ago that lasted 11 seconds. He deleted the record, but he deleted it from the primary log. The secondary buffer retained a fragment. She tilted her head slightly, those blunt-filed horns catching the light. I'm not accusing you of anything. It doesn't sound that way. I'm telling you what I found because you're the only person in this operation who has given me reason to believe you're paying attention to the same things I am. She paused. I'm also telling you because if Nam is planning what I think he's planning, you're on one of those operational teams, and you're walking into a sealed hub. He set down the tablet. Met her eyes deep amber with the elongated pupil of Gorvak evolutionary heritage, holding something that wasn't quite readable in human terms but was, he'd come to think over months of watching her, closest to a kind of weary precision. She dealt in facts. She offered them when she chose to, and she had chosen to offer him this one. Why, he asked. She was quiet for a moment. My father walked into a sealed situation because the person who sent him in never told him what they'd actually planned. He was 31. He'd been singing the Gorvak lineage since he was 7. He was good at it. She paused. I find that I object to people being sent into things without the information they need. He looked at her for a long moment. The stone in his chest shifted. He thought about Dorev's voice on the compies, 6 months ago, telling him that he had developed an unusual degree of operational fluency with the syndicate's inner circle, and that this was exactly what was needed. He thought about Fu, who had vouched for him without knowing what he was, and who was going to be standing in the central processing hub in 3 days when the doors sealed. He thought about 11 months of careful distance from everything that was actually happening. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. She was good at waiting. It took him 30 seconds to say it. He'd rehearsed versions of this kind of conversation. There was a protocol for it, a legal framework, a series of statements that were meant to offer the operative some protection and the potential informant a legible path forward. He didn't use any of it. He just told her, in plain language, who he was and what he'd been doing and what was going to happen in 3 days. When he was done, she was very still for a long moment. How long, she said. 11 months. She absorbed this the way she absorbed everything, not with visible shock, but with that internal processing stillness, running the calculation. The inventory records you reviewed. Documented and submitted, your legal standing is solid. Dorev, my handler, she's not committed yet, but she's not closed to a civilian exit. That depends on the next 72 hours. Varha turned away from him toward the inventory surface, resting her hands on its edge. He watched her process it. He'd seen her process other things, setbacks, bad numbers, the kind of operational information that requires you to rearrange everything you thought you knew. She was methodical about it. She didn't panic. She worked through it, and when she came out the other side, she was the same person she'd been going in, just recalibrated. You should have told me, she said. Yes. I might have worked with you from the beginning. I know, I didn't know you at the beginning. She was quiet. Then, what do you need me to do? Meridian is happening regardless. Nam is running the job, and whatever he has planned for afterward, we can't stop the job from being set up. But I need to know exactly what changed in those exit routes, and I need documentation that ties Nam's communication to an attempt to eliminate the operational teams. She turned back around. That's not difficult. The secondary buffer fragment with context from the primary log deletion establishes a clear pattern. A pause. Nam is selling us to a compact enforcement contact, presumably in exchange for protection on the isotope deal itself. The operational teams take the arrest. Nam walks with the buyer access intact. He stared at her. I calculated it this morning, she said, with the tone of someone explaining something obvious. The communication duration, the route changes, the timing. I've been doing this for 4 years. I know what a burn looks like. She tilted her head, something that might have been dark humor moving through her expression. I assumed it would eventually come from the compact side. I didn't anticipate that you would be the compact side. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it with the specific weight of the word, not the weight of regret for what he'd done, because he didn't regret the 11 months or what they'd produced, but the weight of knowing that he'd been using her careful trust for purposes she hadn't consented to, and that was a thing worth apologizing for regardless of the operational justification. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. That's why I told you about the exit routes. A pause. Now, we have 72 hours. How are we doing this? He pressed the compies. 1 pulse, then 2, emergency contact signal. Dorev answered in 4 seconds. She'd been awake. She was always awake when something was developing, and she'd concluded it was developing. He didn't know how she knew, had never figured it out in 6 years of working with her. Some quality of attention that never fully switched off. Cal 3, she said. I have a complication. I assumed. A pause. Tell me. He told her. He told her about the exit routes and the secondary buffer fragment and Varha's analysis, and then he told her about Varha, the full picture, not the summary version, not the operational assessment. He told her about the voice and the father and 7 years of silence, because those were the things that mattered, and because Dorev had been doing this long enough to know that the human details were never irrelevant. When he finished, the line was quiet for a moment. She built the documentation herself, Dorev said. Over 4 years of working inside the syndicate, yes. She had access to things I didn't. She came to you with information that implicated you in what she was describing. She came to me with information that could keep both of us from walking into a sealed room. The implication was incidental. He paused. She's not syndicate in the way Nam and Fu are syndicate. She's a weapons coordinator who took the work because it was available and has never touched a piece that violated compact ordinance. I've checked the records going back to her start date. A long pause. The quality of Dorev's silences had always been informative. This one was the one that meant she was making a decision she hadn't intended to make, and making it anyway because the case for it was solid. You have 72 hours, she said. Document everything she produces. I want the communication fragment, the root analysis, and a full chain of custody for each piece. If the legal team can work with it, I'll authorize the civilian track. A pause. Vask. Yeah. Don't let it affect your judgment. You've told me that before. And here we are again, she cut the line. The next 3 days were the kind of work that Soren had done before, but not quite like this. Not with a partner who had already processed the betrayal and come out the other side of it. Not with someone who could run parallel calculations on both sides of the problem, because she understood both sides from having lived them. Var had documented Nam's communication fragment with a precision that would have made Dorev's evidence team weep grateful tears. She mapped every route modification, with timestamps, cross-referenced against Nam's access logs, and the compact enforcement contact's known operational signature. She built a case that was, by the time she was done with it, not an argument but a fact. Soren relayed it to Dorev in pieces, during the 3 contact windows that opened over those days. He relayed Varha's situation in parallel. Dorev listened without interruption, which was how he knew she was taking it seriously. She built this documentation herself, Dorev said, during the second window. Over the course of 3 days, and with access to materials she sourced and interpreted independently, yes. She didn't have to bring it to you. She didn't have to, no. A pause. Why did she? Soren thought about this. He thought about a father who sang. He thought about 7 years of silence. He thought about a voice like a cello played underwater and the moment he'd said, without thinking, what he actually heard. She objects, he said, to people being sent into things without the information they need. Another long pause. Vask. Dorev's tone had shifted, the professional flatness was still there, but something underneath it had moved. It was how she sounded when she was going to say something that mattered and wasn't going to flag it as such. The operational teams going into Meridian, Fu Hareth is among them. Yes. He brought you in. Yes. Silence. Is there anything in the documentation that gives him a civilian path? He'd known the answer for weeks. He'd checked. He'd checked twice, hoping he'd missed something, and he hadn't. No, he said. Fu's operational record ties him directly to 3 of the ordnance violations in the isotope channel. He knew what the hardware was for. Dorev said nothing for a moment. All right, she cut the line. He sat with that for a long time. Outside the syndicate's operations suite, the station went on in its indifferent cycle. A saxophone wailed somewhere. No, not a saxophone. He was thinking of something else, some other time, some other city on fire. What he actually heard was the ventilation system's pressure drop and the distant clang of a cargo lift. He put his hands flat on the work table and breathed until the weight of the calculation settled into something he could carry again. Then he went back to the documentation. In between, they worked. They sat across from each other at the work table in the side room, and they processed the documentation and they talked about the things that were developing in front of them. And sometimes, in the late shift quiet when the ventilation systems became audible and the station exhaled around them, they talked about other things. She told him about the 17 names Gorvak had for the gas giant, not the way a xenolinguist would explain it, but the way someone who had grown up with them would, as a small child's education in the nature of patience. The first name you learned was the simple one. The last name you learned was the one that required you to understand that patience and inevitability were not the same quality, that patience is chosen, and inevitability is not, and that the important question is always which one you're practicing. He told her about Waystation 9, and the gray briefing room, and Dorev's flat voice explaining the mechanics of becoming someone else. He told her that the thing nobody mentioned in those briefings was that the version of yourself you used for cover was not a fiction. It was a selection. You chose the parts that were real and led with them, and buried the parts that might give you away. And the work of 11 months was the slow, accumulating pressure of that selection. The parts you'd buried pushing back up because they were real too and had nowhere else to go. Varha listened to this with her characteristic focused stillness. When he was done, she said, "That sounds like the Gorvak description of honorable war. You go in with everything you are. You only survive if the true parts are strong enough." He thought about that for a long time afterward. On the last night before the job, he couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk and listened to the station and thought about Fu, who was going to be in that central processing hub, who had vouched for him without knowing what he was and who was also, by any reasonable accounting, a man who had done things that required accounting for. The math of it was not clean. It never was. He'd learned that about undercover work. You wanted the math to be clean, wanted there to be a clear line between the people you were protecting and the people you were taking down, and sometimes there was. Sometimes you were lucky enough for it to be a clear line. And sometimes Fu was a person who had gotten good at violence too early, and had a laugh like a door opening, and had, last week, given Soren a flask of something that tasted like engine coolant and laughed at his expression, and was also going to spend several years in a compact detention facility for things he had actually done. The math was not clean, but the alternative, letting the Meridian job proceed, letting 37 colony systems bleed isotope reserves, letting Nam walk away with his deal intact while his own people took the fall, that math was worse. Soren had stopped pretending he could escape the weight of the calculation. He just made sure he could carry it correctly. The day of the Meridian job, the station ran its normal rhythms with the indifference of machinery. Old Yellow turned outside the viewports, vast and slow and unconcerned. The cargo crews rotated. The translation channels murmured. Soren had breakfast in the common area of the syndicate's sub-level suite, a habit he'd maintained throughout the 11 months, finding that shared meals with the Keth staff produced more useful ambient intelligence than almost anything else, the looseness of informal conversation carrying information that formal operational channels never would. He ate and listened, and said nothing that mattered, and thought about the day ahead, and thought that this was the last morning of a particular version of his life, and felt both ready for that and not, in the specific way that most significant transitions feel. The simultaneous rightness and grief of a door that only opens one direction. The markets on the upper ring opened for business, and the maintenance crews on the lower ring went about their appointed rounds, and none of them knew that 3 Keth Syndicate operational teams were converging on a compact depository, and none of them knew that 12 compact intercept officers were converging on the same points from 3 directions, and none of them knew that the operations director was expecting to hand his own people to an enforcement contact in exchange for a private deal. Soren was on the internal coordination relay. That part was accurate. What Nam had not been told was that the relay room had 3 exits, not 2, because the third was a maintenance access point that didn't appear on the current floor plan because Varha had pulled the original architectural records and found that a previous renovation had bricked over the door rather than removing it. Varha had unbricked it over the previous night, working quietly and alone, and had sent him a 2-word message on the secure channel afterward. Doors open. He'd sat with that for a moment, looking at his communicator in the dim light of his bunk, and thought that there was a version of that message that was about a door in a depot, and a version that was about considerably more than that, and that they were probably the same message. The job went the way jobs go when everything has already been decided, and the participants just don't know it yet. The 3 entry teams hit the depository's exterior access points with the precision of people who had planned something well, and were executing it well. The compact intercept teams hit the exterior points from the other side with the precision of people who had been given very good advance information. There was noise. There were weapons. There were the kinds of brief violent moments that happen when intelligent species with strong survival instincts meet each other in enclosed spaces with conflicting objectives. Soren stayed on the relay until the last entry team confirmed in custody. He heard Nam's voice on the operations channel, cool and unhurried, coordinating something, except what he was coordinating, Soren now knew, was his own exit, not the operation. Nam had calculated his path and was walking it, as he always did, and the calculation had not included the possibility that someone inside his own organization had been doing the same thing from the other direction for 11 months. He heard Fu's voice, 3 seconds later, in the field, clipped and professional, the voice of someone who didn't know yet. He held that in his mind for a moment, Fu not knowing yet, Fu doing the job he was doing with the competence he had, and what it would feel like in approximately 90 seconds when the doors sealed and he understood. He let himself feel that. It seemed important not to not feel it. Then he went through the 3rd exit. He heard the hub door seal 3 seconds after he cleared the maintenance access. The sound was final, a mechanical certainty, the kind of sound that means a thing has been decided and the deciding is over. He stood in the tunnel and listened to it and let himself register it fully. Fu's voice, cut off mid-coordination, understanding arriving in the gap between one syllable and the next. The sound of a person discovering they have been sold by someone they trusted. He'd been that person once, briefly, early in his career, before he knew enough to see it coming. He still remembered the particular quality of it, not anger at first, just a recalibration. The sudden awareness that the map you'd been using was someone else's map, drawn to serve purposes you hadn't known about. And then, after the recalibration, the anger, clean and cold and entirely earned. He hoped Fu would find the cold, clean version of it. He thought he probably would. Fu was not a man given to hot responses. He was a man who processed things and then acted on the processing, and the acting was usually precise. Soren had no particular comfort to offer him, and so he offered nothing, only the acknowledgement, internal, unavailable to Fu, that he understood what it felt like, and that it had been done anyway because it had to be done, and that neither of those things erased the other. He moved through the tunnel. The maintenance tunnel beyond it was low-ceilinged and warm and smelled of the station's circulatory systems, the metabolic waste of a structure that was, in a meaningful sense, alive. He moved through it quickly, navigating by the map Varha had reconstructed from the architectural records, and came out in a service corridor on sublevel 3 and found her there. She was standing in the corridor with her arms crossed and her horns angled slightly forward in the posture she adopted when she was waiting for something she wasn't entirely sure was going to arrive. When she saw him, she uncrossed her arms, and something in her jaw released. "Exit routes," he said. All three confirmed sealed. Nam's enforcement contact is Magistrate Oral, who is currently being apprehended by Dorev's secondary team based on the communication documentation. She paused. Nam didn't make it to his exit. He attempted to use a service shaft on sublevel 1 that was flagged in the intercept brief. He nodded. He felt the shape of the 11 months closing like a long argument that had finally reached its conclusion. Not clean. Correct. "You could have left," he said. "Before the job, you had enough information to make yourself scarce." "So could you," she said. "I had to be on the relay." "I know, that's why I stayed." She paused. Someone needed to unblock a door. He thought about what to say to that. He'd spent 11 months talking around the thing he actually meant, using the precise language of operational necessity to keep a careful distance from the fact of who he was when none of it was a cover. He was tired of the distance. "Dorev confirmed your civilian track this morning," he said. "Full documentation. The inventory records establish no compact ordnance violations. There's a standard deposition process, which I'll be in for the next 3 weeks, and then it's done." He paused. "After that, I was thinking about going somewhere that's not a gray market isotope depot, maybe with someone who has strong opinions about calibration standards." Varha looked at him for a long, still moment. Then she made a sound, low, resonant, carrying those deep harmonic undertones that human ears were apparently alone in fully appreciating. It took him a moment to recognize it as laughter, but when he did, he felt it in the oldest part of his animal brain, the part that knew, before conscious processing, what happiness sounded like. "You know nothing about calibration standards," she said. "I could learn." She was quiet for a moment. Outside in the depot proper, he could hear Dorev's team moving, the professional sounds of an operation closing down. The case that had taken 11 months was finishing its final motion. He felt it like a door closing somewhere, but not like an ending, more like the particular silence that comes after a significant sound, when the air is still holding the shape of what it carried. "Before an important action," Varha said, "a Gorvak sings the lineage of those who went before." He understood from her tone that this was both a statement about tradition and a statement about right now. He waited. She sang. It was not loud. It filled the corridor anyway, filled it the way deep water fills a vessel, pressing to every surface, finding the resonant frequency of the space and settling into it. The harmonics went into his chest and his bones and the middle ear that was apparently designed, by whatever accident of biology, to receive exactly this. 7 years of silence. 15 generations of Gorvak who had been fools and had been killed by systems, and who had also sung this, in the moments before significant things happened, so that the ones who came before were present in the ones who came after. He did not understand the words. He didn't need to. The thing being communicated was not contained in the words. It was in the depth of the sound, the particular quality of a voice shaped by years of practice, singing something old into a space that could hold it correctly. His mother had hummed in a kitchen. These were not the same. But they were the same kind of thing. The continuation of a pattern, carried forward by someone who had decided the carrying was worth something, passed now into a service corridor on sub-level 3 of a trading station, orbiting a gas giant with 17 names. There was a line of melody that kept recurring, the same phrase, in a slightly different register each time it returned, as if it were being held up to different lights, and each light showed a different quality of it. He thought about how music worked, how you could return to the same phrase and find more in it each time, not because the phrase had changed, but because the listening had. Because every repetition was both the original thing and the accumulated weight of all the times you'd heard it before, and the weight was not a burden but a depth, and the depth was the whole point. He thought that this was probably what 15 generations sounded like, if you could hear it correctly. When she finished, the corridor held the shape of the sound for a moment in its walls and then let it go. "My father," she said, "would have liked you." He thought about fragments of something old and human, carried without knowing what to call it. "My mother would have liked you too," he said. She had strong opinions about calibration standards as well. Varha made that sound again, the low, resonant laughter, and they moved through the maintenance tunnel toward the extraction point, where Dorev's secondary team was waiting, where the paperwork that would take 3 weeks to complete was already beginning to accumulate, where the bureaucratic machinery of the compact would process 11 months of undercover work into a series of custody files and legal dispositions. And none of that would be the important thing later, when he tried to remember the day. They came out of the maintenance tunnel into a wider service bay on sub-level 1, and the light was the cool blue-white of the station's emergency overrides, and Dorev was standing at the bay's far end with 2 of her officers and a data tablet, and that expression she wore when operations had gone better than she'd been prepared for, a slight tightening around the eyes. Not quite relief, something more like a scientist acknowledging that a calculated result had come in correctly. She looked at Soren, then at Varha, then at Soren again. "Cow 3, she said in that flat, exact voice. "Nam is in custody. The enforcement contact is in custody. The primary and secondary entry teams are all processing. We have the isotope buyer coordinates from the relay recordings." She paused. "Good work." He nodded. Dorev's eyes moved to Varha again, holding there with the careful professional attention of someone taking a measure. Varha returned the look with the focused still patience of someone who did not require approval to know what she was. "The documentation you produced," Dorev said after a moment, "is thorough." "It is accurate," Varha said. Dorev made a sound that was probably the closest she got to a laugh under field conditions. "Yes, it is." She made a note on the data tablet. "You'll be in deposition processing for 72 hours. After that, you're on a standard civilian track hold for 14 days while the legal team reviews the inventory records. Then you're cleared." She paused. "I'm told the calibration documentation alone will be useful for prosecution purposes for the next several years." Varha tilted her head. "It should be. I am very good at my job." Dorev glanced at Soren with an expression that he had learned over 6 years to interpret as she was trying not to smile. "The station's upper ring has a transit connector to the Kelveth shipping route. It runs through 3 systems before it hits the compact's core networks. A lot of civilian traffic, various species, mostly legitimate. Good work opportunities for people with mixed skill sets." She looked back at her tablet. "I mention this for no particular reason." He looked at her for a moment. She kept her eyes on the tablet, making notes with the absorbed concentration of someone who had said nothing, and intended to keep having said nothing. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, still looking at the tablet. "There's a cantina on level 7 that makes something called a stellar broth that is, according to the 3 officers I sent to depose the dockworkers yesterday, the best thing they've eaten since departure." She made another note. "I mention this also for no particular reason." He started to say something and then didn't, and beside him Varha made that low sound again, The laughter that lived in the register's human ears were alone in fully appreciating, and Dorev's mouth twitched once, very briefly, before she went back to being exactly what she was. They stood for a moment in the service bay with the operational machinery of the compact closing down around them, the sounds of custody processing and documentation compilation, and the particular bureaucratic rhythm of a large case reaching its end state. Soren had been in this moment before, the moment after, when the adrenaline of the operation had resolved into the flat procedural reality of what came next. He'd always found it disorienting in a specific way, the enormity of what had just happened, compressed suddenly into forms and depositions and chain of custody requirements. The world's insistence on reducing decisive human moments to paperwork. He didn't mind it tonight. Tonight the paperwork felt like something earned. One of Dorev's officers, young, serious-faced, the kind of new professional who was still calibrating how much deference to show in which directions, came forward with a data tablet and a careful expression. He looked at Varha with the slightly uncertain attention of someone who had been briefed about her involvement, but was still working out how to place her. "The civilian track documentation," Dorev said, from behind him without looking up from her own tablet. "Start with her inventory records. 14 months of syndicate employment, 0 ordinance violations. It should process straightforwardly." The young officer nodded and turned back to Varha with slightly more confidence. Varha looked at the tablet he extended, took it, reviewed the first screen with the unhurried attention of someone who never signs anything without reading it first, and then looked up at the officer. "This is accurate," she said, in that voice that lived in frequencies the young Keth officer probably couldn't fully process. He blinked anyway, some quality of it landing regardless, and nodded. "Good," Varha said and signed. They processed upward through the levels as the station returned to its normal rhythms. Old Yellow turned outside the viewports, unconcerned. The cargo crews rotated. The translation channels murmured. The upper levels were a different world from the sub-levels. He'd been down there long enough that the adjustment took a moment, the softer lighting, the ambient sound of open spaces, the particular density of mixed-species civilian life that the tourist information would call vibrant, and that mostly just meant loud and unpredictable in ways that were, by virtue of their unpredictability, reassuring. Nothing that was genuinely dangerous happened in spaces this casually alive. The danger lived in the quiet places, the controlled places, the places where the ambient sound was ventilation systems and cargo machinery, and the specific silence of people choosing their words carefully. He took a breath of air that smelled like food and chemicals and other species' metabolic signatures, and felt something in his shoulders release that he hadn't consciously known was clenched. Varha stopped at the level 7 entrance to the civilian corridor and looked at the space with the expression she used for assessments. She was doing it the same way she did everything, methodically, completely, without rushing the conclusion. He watched her take in the lighting amber, warm, the density moderately busy mixed species, no visible Keth, the ambient sound high, layered, disorganized in the way that meant nothing was being controlled, and the smell complex, organic, not recycled air. "This is better," she said. "Then sub-level 2. "Yes. I've been on this station for 4 years, she said, "and I have spent most of them in sub-level 2. He thought about that. 4 years in a gray market operation, in the maintenance levels, navigating a hierarchy that communicated with you via text relay, because your voice irritated their chemoreceptors. 4 years of being comprehensively useful to an organization that had never made any particular effort to make you comfortable in it. "Well," he said, "we're here now." She looked at him. Something moved in her expression, not the weary precision she wore for assessments, not the focused still attention she brought to problems, something quieter and less armored than either of those. "We are," she said. On level 7, the cantina Dorev had mentioned with elaborate casualness was doing its evening service, And the stellar broth was exactly what the deposing officers had described. And Varha had opinions about the spice ratios that she shared in the voice that resonated in the deep structural frequencies of the room. And a Keth trader 2 tables over flinched slightly at the sound, and a pair of Kelsath dockworkers turned toward it with expressions of instinctive recognition. The oldest part of their animal brains receiving the signal before their conscious minds had processed the species. And Soren sat across from her and listened to every word. He noticed, as she talked, that she was talking differently than she had in the sublevels. Not different content, still precise, still meticulous, still delivering more information per syllable than most species managed per sentence, but with a quality he hadn't heard before, a slight looseness, the specific vocal quality of a person who has stopped calculating how they are being received and is simply speaking. He thought about 7 years of silence. He thought about 1 year of a human who could hear correctly. He thought about the corridor and what she'd said after, "My father would have liked you," and what he'd said back, which was true. He thought that the Gorvak were right about patience and inevitability being different things. That patience was chosen. That you could decide, in a service corridor on sub-level 3 of a trading station, to carry something forward, a song, a tradition, the continuation of a thing that systems kept trying to end, and that this choosing was the most human act there was, and also, apparently, the most Gorvak. He thought that maybe that was the thing that translated between species, not language, not biology, not the shared accident of oxygen breathing, the choosing, the continuation, the decision to pass something forward into a world that would keep trying to take it back. The station hummed around them. The lights were the warm amber of the civilian levels, not the harsh utility white of the sub-levels, and through the viewport the gas giants' cloud bands were moving in their slow perpetual churn, and it was possible, sitting there, in the amber light, in the ordinary noise of a public space on a station orbiting a planet with 17 names, to feel the particular quality of stillness that comes when something has been resolved. Not finished, resolved, the way a chord resolves not silence but completion, the tension finding its resting place. He thought about 11 months. He thought about what he'd asked Dorev at the beginning when she'd asked him if he could do it, whether he could let himself actually like them, just enough, and still pull the trigger when the time came. He thought about what he'd said, "I'll let you know." The trigger had been pulled. The case was closed. The people who needed to be held accountable were being held accountable. He'd done what he'd been sent to do. He also thought about the things that weren't on the mission brief. The way Fu had passed the flask and laughed at him. The particular quality of Nam's quietness, which had always fascinated him even knowing what it was, the self-sufficient indifference of someone who had long ago stopped needing other people to confirm his choices. The Keth logistics staff who had a running argument about manifest verification that neither of them wanted to resolve because the argument itself was, he suspected, the point, a private performance of ongoing relationship, coded as professional dispute. The small human textures of non-human lives, which were not actually human textures at all, but were something he'd never had a word for. The universal small motions of people trying to make meaning inside the systems that were grinding them. He'd learned something from 11 months that wasn't in the briefing and couldn't have been. You could become so good at reading a place that the reading became caring, and the caring became knowledge, and the knowledge was the most important operational asset you could possibly have, and also the thing that cost you the most to carry back out. Both were true at once. The op was clean, by any accounting standard. The human cost of it to himself was also real and would take time to settle. He thought he could live with both of those things. He thought, in fact, that being able to live with both was probably the correct outcome, that the alternative, coming back out clean and unchanged, would have been its own kind of failure. And across the table from him, Varha was explaining, with characteristic precision, exactly what was wrong with the Cantina's spice calibration, and why a correct ratio was not merely a preference but a structural matter. And her voice was filling the space the way it filled every space it was allowed into, completely, precisely, with the depth and resonance that 7 years of silence had never diminished, and a year of being heard had begun, carefully, to restore. He would tell Dorev when he wrote the debrief, "I let you know." But that was for later. For now there was the stellar broth, and the amber light, and the voice in the room that the rest of the room didn't quite know what to do with, and Soren Vask, who had spent 11 months learning how not to be himself and had come back to himself anyway, listening to every word. Outside, Old Yellow turned, patient, inevitable, 17 names for the same thing, none of them wrong.